Hello and welcome. We're going to briefly talk about Chivingtons Massacre, also known as the Massacre of Sand Creek, and how that came to being and why it's kind of important. And this is an example of one of the true kind of disgraceful events in U.S. history that's often swept under the rug. And because it's kind of so horrendous, but just the understanding of how a lot of people viewed native peoples and why this massacre pretty much gets off without any problems. And to understand this, we have to go to 1864, so it's just slightly before the onset of our class. And on June 11th, 1864, Nathaniel Huntgate and his wife and two children were being, as they said, slaughtered by in Chivington, Colorado, by Native people, and it is blamed on a band of Cheyenne and a Arapaho, and what ends up happening is it's actually blamed on them, but it's probably actually not actually a Native people incident that happened, but was framed in that way. So it's theorized. We don't exactly know. So it could actually have been a Native people raid, but by the Cheyenne or the Arapaho, but we're not quite sure. But what ends up happening is that the Cheyenne and Arapaho were actually negotiating a treaty with the U.S. Army. And so on November 29th, or November 28th, they end up encamping outside of Sand Creek. And there's about, I think they estimate between like 800 and 1,000 Arapaho and Cheyenne that go to this treaty. And what ends up happening is, as the Cheyenne and the Arapaho travel, as well as other Native cultures, they bring the whole family unit. So they bring the women and the children, as well as the warriors and the chiefs, and they come together. And so what happens is that the Cheyenne and the Arapaho join together to do this peace treaty, and they are outside of Sand Creek. They set up camp there, and the warriors and the elders, or most of the warriors and the elders, end up going to this peace treaty. Well, and one of the things they do say, that a flag was flying of peace over the Cheyenne and Arapaho camp. Now, it's important to know it's not all the Cheyenne, it's not all the Arapaho, but it's a large chunk of the nations that are there. And so on November 29th, the night before, then the 28th, the Colorado Volunteers of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry under Colonel John Chivington, who is a Methodist pastor. He also fought during the Civil War. And so him and a band, about 750 of them, of the army, are outside of this encampment by the Cheyenne and Arapaho. And Chivington, ends up getting kind of drunk the night before, and they're talking about possibly doing something. And he ends up the next day, on November 29th, after this terrible night of drinking, he ends up ordering an attack on the Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment at Sand Creek. And it's important to note that his number 2 ends up saying, no, you shouldn't do this, and sets out from this. So this attack happens, and it is brutal. And this is kind of a retaliation for Hungate's deaths. And so what ends up happening is the soldiers go in there and they start firing upon the Cheyenne and Arapaho. And it's primarily women and children. There is a few soldiers, but it's primarily women and children, and the infirm. And they go in, and not only they fire on them, they scare off the horses. Some manage to escape, and but what they end up doing is they they end up raping a large amount of women, including women who were killed. They the brutality in this is pretty terrible. They end up cutting off fingers of people, anyone who tried to escape, like even some people who were wounded. They end up torturing. They used toddlers as target practice. They literally threw infants up into the air and shot them. But also what they do is with the remains of a lot of the women, or of the women, they remove their breasts, they remove their labias and other parts, and they end up wearing them as trophies. They had necklaces that were full of breasts. They end up taking the vaginas and strapping them across their saddlebags. And it's believed that 163 to almost, they've said larger numbers, and these numbers we're not quite sure, but it's estimated that 163 Arapaho and Cheyenne were killed, and out of that, 110 of them were women and children. And they left a lot, instead of burying the dead, which obviously they went with this kind of brutality, they leave them to be consumed by coyotes and vultures and other things. And on their way back from this triumphant march after Sand Creek, they go to Fort Lyon, which is where they were holding the peace treaty, with displaying in full regalia all these dismembered body parts. And then weeks later, they end up going to Denver and waving around the parts of the dead to show their superiority. And the question is, what happens to Chivington? He's put on, the army ends up going to put him onto trial, and he retires from the army, so nothing happens to him. He actually goes into exile for a while. The Colorado governor, who's named John Adams, ends up being removed from office, and nothing ends up happening to Chivington or most of the men who committed the atrocities. It is something that was extremely detrimental to the spirits of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and this is spread because one of the alliances that happened between the Cheyenne was also with the Lakota. I mean, sometimes they were at war, but often the Lakota and the Cheyenne, in fact, during the Battle of Greasy Grass, you have Cheyenne and Lakota together. And it's important to note there's actually 7 different bands of Lakota underneath. I'm just kind of putting them in the broad sense of Lakota. Also, Lakota is known as the unflattering term of the Sioux, which wasn't embraced at that time. It was a slang, but the Lakota in general get together, and so this story is passed on because so many women and children. So there, it creates a lot of animosity behind it. So I wanted to share with you one of the more cruel things. There's a lot of myths of like Indians, known as Indian scalping, and whatnot that occurs during this period. But I am bringing up this to show you that the U.S. government and a lot of the settler population and stuff is just as guilty as doing horrendous things, if not the same or worse, to the native peoples. So that is Chivingtons Massacre, also known as Massacre of Sand Creek. I apologize for this disturbing nature.